Science has given us antibiotics, space travel, and the internet. But not every experiment leads to progress. Some cross lines so terrifying, so unethical, they leave behind more questions than answers. Governments, scientists, and even psychologists have at times turned real people into test subjects, all in the name of discovery. And while some of these deadly experiments were hidden for years, their horrifying effects still haunt us today. From secret mind control programs to radiation exposure on unsuspecting civilians, this video isn't for the faint of heart. These are the 15 deadly experiments that went too far and left experts stunned. Because sometimes, curiosity doesn't just kill the cat, it rewrites the rules of human decency. Let's start off with number 15, the Guatemalan syphilis experiments. In the late 1940s, the US government secretly ran one of the most horrifying medical experiments in history. Under the direction of Dr. John Cutler, researchers deliberately infected over 1,300 Guatemalan prisoners, sex workers, soldiers, and even mentally ill patients with syphilis, all without their knowledge or consent. Why? To study how the disease progressed and to test treatments like penicillin. Victims were intentionally exposed through forced sexual encounters or direct injections. Some were given treatment, but many were left to suffer. The long-term effects were devastating, with countless deaths, lifelong complications, and generational trauma. The experiment remained hidden for decades until it was finally exposed in 2010. When the truth came out, the US government issued an official apology, but for the victims and their families, no words could undo the suffering. It was a horrifying reminder that medical ethics were not always a given, and that power, when unchecked, can turn doctors into monsters. Number 14, the Green Run. In 1949, residents of Washington state had no idea they were breathing in radioactive fallout, courtesy of a top-secret US government experiment. The Green Run was a classified test at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, where researchers intentionally released large amounts of radioactive iodine and xenon into the atmosphere, without warning the public. The purpose? To study how radiation is dispersed in the air. The result? An invisible cloud of radioactive material spread across communities, exposing thousands of people. Reports later revealed that contamination levels were hundreds of times higher than what was considered safe. For decades, people living near Hanford experienced unusually high rates of cancer, birth defects, and thyroid diseases. When the experiment was finally declassified, outrage followed. But, as with many government-backed experiments, the damage was already done. The Green Run proved that, to some, human lives were just variables in a dangerous scientific equation, with consequences that would linger for generations. Number 13. The elephant on LSD. What happens when you inject an elephant with an extreme dose of LSD? A group of Oklahoma scientists thought it was a great question, until the answer horrified them. In 1962, researchers at the University of Oklahoma decided to test whether LSD could induce musth, a natural period of aggressive behavior in male elephants. But instead of a controlled experiment, they went nuclear. They injected Tusco, a 3,000-kilogram elephant, with 297 milligrams of LSD, an amount nearly 1,000 times the human dose. Within minutes, Tusco collapsed, seized violently, and died within an hour. The researchers scrambled for an explanation. Some suggested the dose was simply too high, while others claimed it was a mix of LSD and the drugs they used to try to revive him that led to his death. Either way, the experiment was a disaster, one that not only killed a magnificent animal but also proved absolutely nothing useful. Number 12. Soviet dog head transplants. If there were a mad scientist hall of fame, Soviet surgeon Vladimir Demikov would have a prime spot. In the 1950s, he successfully grafted the head and front legs of one dog onto another's body, creating a grotesque two-headed creature that both lived briefly. Demikoff, a pioneer in organ transplantation, wanted to prove that complex surgeries could be done between different animals. In multiple experiments, he connected two circulatory systems, allowing both heads to drink, move, and even react separately. The results were disturbing. The transplanted heads never lived long, usually dying within days due to immune rejection. But the images of these freakish hybrids spread worldwide. While his research did influence later human transplant procedures, the ethics of his work were horrifying. The Soviet Union proudly showcased his experiments as scientific triumphs. But to the rest of the world, it was proof that the line between medical advancement and pure cruelty was dangerously thin. Number 11. The Milgram Experiment. How far will ordinary people go to obey an authority figure, even if it means harming someone else? That's what psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to find out in one of the most unsettling psychological experiments ever conducted. Participants were told they were part of a study on learning. Their job: administer electric shocks to a person in another room whenever they answered a question incorrectly. What they didn't know was that the shocks weren't real, and the victim was an actor. As the experiment progressed, the actor would scream in pain, beg to stop, and eventually go silent. But here's the disturbing part. 65% of participants continued shocking their victim up to the highest voltage, 450 volts, just because an authoritative figure in a lab coat told them to. Even though they showed distress, most obeyed, proving that under the right circumstances, people will commit horrific acts just because they're ordered to. Milgram's study revealed a terrifying truth. Blind obedience can turn anyone into a monster. Number 10. Operation Sea Spray. Imagine waking up one morning, breathing in the crisp air, and unknowingly inhaling a cloud of bacteria secretly released by your own government. In 1950, the U.S. Navy conducted a biological warfare test over San Francisco, spraying a massive bacterial cloud to see how vulnerable a major city would be to a bio-attack. The bacteria, Serratia marquescens, was believed to be harmless. Spoiler, it wasn't. In the weeks that followed, dozens of residents fell mysteriously ill with urinary and respiratory infections, and at least one person died. The government never warned the public. This wasn't a one-time experiment. Similar tests were carried out across U.S. cities for over 20 years. It wasn't until the 1970s that the government admitted to it. By then, the damage was already done, proving that when science and national security collide, ethics are often the first casualty. Number 9. The Monster Study. Orphans are already some of the most vulnerable children in society, so naturally, a group of researchers decided to experiment on them. The Monster Study was a twisted psychological experiment designed to see if negative reinforcement could cause stuttering. Led by Dr. Wendell Johnson at the University of Iowa, the study took 22 orphaned children, half of whom already had speech problems. Some were praised for their fluency, while others were harshly criticized, belittled, and punished for every small mistake, even those who never stuttered before. The result? Many of the children who had been psychologically tormented developed speech impediments that lasted for life. Others suffered severe emotional trauma. The worst part? This study was never even published out of fear of backlash. It wasn't until 2001, more than 60 years later, that the surviving victims were acknowledged. Some received a small settlement, but nothing could erase the damage done. Number 8. Nazi medical experiments. Few experiments in history match the sheer horror of Nazi medical experiments. Conducted in concentration camps under the twisted supervision of doctors like Joseph Mengele, these so-called studies were nothing more than torture disguised as science. Prisoners, many of them children, were subjected to unimaginable cruelty. Some were injected with chemicals to try and change their eye color. Others were sewn together to create conjoined twins. Many were deliberately infected with diseases just to see how their bodies would respond. High-altitude tests, exposure to freezing temperatures, and forced sterilizations were just part of the nightmare. Most victims died from the procedures. Those who survived were left with permanent disabilities, horrific scars, and lifelong trauma. After the war, these atrocities led to the Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical guidelines for human experimentation. But the fact that such rules had to be created at all is proof of just how far science had fallen during those dark years. Number 7. The atomic soldiers. During the height of nuclear testing, thousands of American soldiers were exposed to radiation on purpose, without their consent or knowledge. These men, now known as the atomic soldiers, were used to study the effects of nuclear explosions up close. Troops were ordered to march directly into the blast zones minutes after a bomb went off. They were told to observe the explosion, test equipment, and sometimes even sit in trenches just a few miles from ground zero. The government wanted to know how nuclear warfare would affect soldiers in battle, but they did so at the cost of real human lives. Many of these men developed cancer, organ failure, and severe radiation sickness, yet their suffering was covered up for decades. Even when they sought medical help, the government denied their exposure had anything to do with their conditions. It was only years later that the truth finally came out. Too late for most of them. Number 6. The Philadelphia Experiment. It sounds like a plot ripped from a sci-fi movie, a top-secret military experiment that allegedly made an entire U.S. Navy ship disappear. The Philadelphia Experiment, as the legend goes, was a 1943 test to render the USS Eldridge invisible to radar. According to conspiracy theories, the ship was subjected to a powerful electromagnetic field, which caused it to vanish completely, only to reappear hundreds of miles away. But when it returned, the crew was in horrific shape, some fused into the metal, others driven insane. Officially, the U.S. Navy denies the experiment ever happened. Most experts say it's just an elaborate myth, fueled by post-war paranoia and misinterpreted scientific research. But even today, whispers about the government meddling with teleportation and invisibility tech refuse to die. Whether real or not, the Philadelphia Experiment remains one of the most chilling military legends in history. Number 5. Project MK-Ultra. Imagine being drugged, hypnotized, and psychologically tortured, all without your consent. That was the reality for hundreds of unsuspecting test subjects in Project MK-Ultra, the CIA's secret experiment in mind control. At the height of the Cold War, the CIA believed that LSD, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation could be used to break a person's will, or even turn them into unwitting assassins. So they tested their theories on prisoners, mental patients, and even ordinary civilians, often without telling them. Some were kept in drug-induced states for weeks. Others were subjected to electroshock therapy so severe it erased their memories. The program ran for over 2 decades until it was finally exposed in the 1970s. But by then, most of the evidence had already been destroyed, leaving behind more questions than answers. Did MK-Ultra succeed in creating real mind-controlled operatives? Well, we may never know. Number 4. The Russian Sleep Experiment. Deep in the annals of Cold War secrecy, the Russian sleep experiment is one of the most disturbing stories ever told. According to the tale, Soviet scientists in the 1940s locked 5 political prisoners in a sealed chamber and pumped in an experimental gas designed to keep them awake for 15 days straight. The results? Utter psychological collapse. At first, the subjects remained coherent, but by day 5, paranoia set in. By day 9, they stopped speaking entirely, whispering unintelligible words to themselves. And then came the horror. they began mutilating themselves, ripping out their own organs, smearing blood on the walls, and even eating their own flesh. When the chamber was finally opened, the surviving subjects screamed in agony, begging to be put back inside. But here's the catch. No official records exist of this experiment. Most experts believe it's an urban legend, yet the psychological horrors of extreme sleep deprivation remain frighteningly real. Number 3. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. For 40 years, the U.S. Public Health Service ran an experiment so unethical that it shattered trust in the medical system forever. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study followed 600 African-American men in Alabama, tracking the effects of untreated syphilis, without their consent. The worst part? The government had the cure and chose not to use it. Even after penicillin became widely available in the 1940s, doctors deliberately withheld treatment just to see how the disease progressed. By the time the study was exposed in 1972, dozens had died. Many had passed the disease to their wives, and even their children were born with congenital syphilis. The revelation caused public outrage, leading to major reforms in medical ethics and informed consent laws. But the damage was already done. The deep distrust it created still lingers today, particularly in Black communities. This wasn't just an experiment gone wrong, it was a betrayal on an unforgivable scale. Number 2. Unit 731. Of all the war crimes committed in history, Unit 731 stands among the most chilling. Under the command of General Shiro Ishii, this secret Japanese research unit conducted live human experiments on prisoners, many of them Chinese civilians, POWs, and even women and children. Victims were subjected to bioweapon tests, frostbite endurance trials, and live dissections, often without anesthesia. Some were infected with deadly diseases like the plague and then studied as they slowly died. Others were tied down and bombarded with grenades or flamethrowers just to see how human bodies responded to explosions. After World War II, the U.S. struck a deal with the scientists of Unit 731. In exchange for their research, many of them were never prosecuted. The full extent of their atrocities remained hidden for decades, and to this day, Japan's acknowledgement of these horrors remains controversial. It wasn't just deadly, it was inhuman. Number 1. The Stanford Prison Experiment. One of the most infamous psychology experiments in history, the Stanford Prison Experiment proved that power corrupts faster than we ever imagined. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo set up a fake prison in the basement of Stanford University and assigned 24 students to play the roles of either guards or prisoners. The results? A psychological nightmare. Within just days, the guards, ordinary college students, became sadistic and abusive, forcing prisoners to perform degrading tasks, stripping them naked, and even using psychological torture. The prisoners broke down emotionally. Some even begged to leave but were denied. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It was shut down in just 6 days because things spiraled out of control so fast. The Stanford Prison Experiment revealed the terrifying ease with which humans conform to roles of power and submission. It wasn't about bad people. It was about how easily good people can become monsters when given control over others. If you have enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon in the next one.